where we carve out space for meaningful conversations that go beyond the grill. I'm Kara Smith, your host and fellow enthusiast for all things tasteful and fulfilling. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Derran, whose journey is varied and inspiring. Born and raised in a small farming community in rural Ohio, Derran went on to earn a degree in exercise science from the University of Toledo. After 8 years of running his own personal training business, he transitioned into content creation and marketing, a path that eventually led him into the Colorado mountains and then onto our team in February. What makes Derran's story particularly compelling is his transformation from a vegetarian diet to a mainly carnivore diet, a shift that was deeply influenced by his views on health and the importance of understanding of where your food comes from. Join us as we explore how Derran's background and life experiences have shaped his approach to food, nutrition, and overall well-being. And we'll leave you with some valuable insight for mindful eating and personal growth. Welcome, Derran.
Thanks, Kara. Happy to be here.
You bet. So, of course, coming from a household where we primarily raised and obviously ate meat, I know that you shared a lot of that being from the Midwest. I'd love to hear where that change took place when you're like, hey, I'm not quite sure this is the track I want to keep tracking, and made a dietary change, a location change, all of those things in your life.
Yeah, so growing up in kind of a small town in Ohio, the word diet wasn't like a thing. I grew up on a lot of meat and potatoes and grew up on 10 acres, and there was a lot of chores and things to be done. So dinner, food in general was, hey, if you're hungry, you're a growing boy, eat more. And it was just a lot of meat and potatoes. And so I grew up playing sports and noticing working as hard as I can compared to my other friends and not seeing the physique that I wanted. They'd be a lot more fit than I was. And so when I went off to school and started to learn diet, I started to realize eating all these processed carbohydrates, things of that nature that I was raised on wasn't helping me reach my physical goals that I wanted to. So I started in college starting to change my diet a little bit then. And then once I made my way out to Colorado and getting into the lifestyles out here, there was so much more diverse diets that people were playing around with. So wanting to get in more and more shape so I could hike more, I could mountain bike more, I started playing around with diets. And I ended up going towards vegetarianism just for a short stint for about 10 months because I had really gotten the meat company, or meat in general, was really getting attacked, right? It wasn't healthy for you. These animals are raised in poor conditions. So I really got inundated with that propaganda, which then led me to be okay, I can't afford to buy meat that I know where it's coming from and how it's raised. So then I transitioned into vegetarianism. And so I was getting a lot of local produce. I lived down the road from a farmer's market. So every weekend I'd go down and get that and started eating that way of life because I also wanted to be closer to my food. Growing up where we did have a big garden. So my dad every year would put out about an acre garden. So we had a lot of fresh produce growing up as kids. And so I wanted to get closer to my food. So I got to know a lot of these local farmers at the farmers markets that I was purchasing from and started this vegetarian journey, which I had a good honeymoon phase the first 3 months that I was into it. Felt like I slimmed down, felt like I was achieving kind of the physical goals, but I was also a personal trainer and working out, 5 to 7 days a week. And so I noticed after that 3-month period that I just didn't have the drive in the gym as more. I was cutting my workout short because I was getting tired. My weight started coming down as far as how much I was able to lift. And then beyond that, I started noticing other things. I was struggling with deep cognitive thought, having, deeper thoughts, being able to pay attention and hold conversations for longer periods of time was getting harder. And then one thing I didn't notice that I did later on was anxiety and depression started spiking. So just small things started causing issues for me, and it just kind of started snowballing. Um, and then, funny enough, I ended up leaving the personal training sphere and transitioning into the content and marketing side for another beef company. And I was able to see how this cattle were being raised. They were out on pasture all day. And so I was like, oh, this, I can afford this now. I can see where this food is coming from. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to have beef. And I had a steak, and it was just like a light switch turned on. Like I just felt like my factory like booted back up, like deep cognitive thought, like all this energy came flowing back that I was just like didn't realize that I was missing. And so that was just a big shift for me, like coming back to the meat side of being like, wow, like my body responds so much better to this high quality protein.
Sure. I love that thought process of listening to what your body's telling you. What kind of advice would you give to listeners in that from their own, personal health journey?
Absolutely. I would say, if coming from my background of personal training, everybody wants to be fit. Everybody wants to be healthy. Everybody wants to be able to play with their kids, be there to care for their significant others or family members. And so understanding your why of like why you want to be healthy is the first and foremost thing. But um, diet in general, our diets are just, when people think of dieting, diet is what you eat, right? And so they're always talking about like, oh, I'm going to go on the keto diet, or I'm going to do this diet. It's not a diet. It's just a way that you're living your life and consuming food. And for those that want to find out what works best for them, you have to implement and see how it affects you, because this blanket one size fits all approach to like our nutrition and our diet and the United States is a total farce, because as humans, we're so diverse. Like what might work for me could be completely harmful for the next person. So as it comes to diet, the best approach I would recommend is implement a diet, but you have to track. You need to track. And it's not just your weight and your inches, but how do you feel? How do you, how is your thought process? How is your sleep cycle? How is your bowel movement cycle? Like all of these things play into our overall health. So implementing a diet, journaling is the biggest thing, and seeing how it affects you, because you may notice like you wake up one day with a lot of anxiety and you can look back and be like, you know what, I introduced dairy yesterday and I know that I have a sensitivity, but I didn't realize that it would cause like these other compounding factors. Or if you consume something and you realize that you're bloated, then what was it that caused you to bloat? Because bloating is not a natural thing for us to experience. So just really journaling and seeing and implementing in your life, and finding a ratio that works best for you, because there's snake oil salesmen out there, and we all want the easy track, right? We just want to be told what to do, but it is a hard journey and you do have to put in the time and effort. And I think at the end of the day, it's the best thing that you can do for yourself is have an understanding of your food and diet.
So we hear so many stories of food healing people, to put that in kind of a frank fashion. And I think you're talking a lot of those concepts of understanding what works for you and how best to fuel your body, to live an optimal life. And it is not the same for everybody. It's not the same for different age classes, or different lifestyles. As you mentioned, you're from the personal training world. You may need more protein if you want to lift heavy. Like just some of the thought processes that are very mindful, I would say, that go into the different pieces of the equation of this puzzle that we call health. What other things would you like to touch on, especially when we start talking about health and food, maybe honing it in on food sourcing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in Western civilizations, and especially the United States, We live in a capitalistic society, which is a great economy, but at the end of the day, the the bottom dollar is what's driving everything. So the bread that you generally are buying in the store now is not the same bread that our ancestors were eating 100 years ago. And that was a big shift for me when it came to diet, because I looked at my grandfather, who was born in 1925, pre-World Wars. Um, and I thought, how did they eat? How did they get their food? How did everything operate? And it was very localized, right? He was the oldest of 15 kids on a farm, and they worked to cultivate a lot of their own food, and whatever they couldn't cultivate, they were able to barter or trade, or at least it was coming from within the county, not across the country like it is now. So what sparked a lot of that change was post-World War II, because our soldiers came back. We saw a lot of starvation in the civilians and opposing soldiers on the other side, and there was the fear of World War III breaking out. So food preservation and stockpiling of food was a big economic boost for the U.S., because they wanted to make sure that our civilians and soldiers were going to be well fed if we were to go into a third world war. Well, that never happened. But then you had built this economic cycle of being able to have food stocked on the shelves, but then also the advancement of gas motors, pesticides, all these things allowed us to yield more crop than per acre as well. So you have this influx of food that we had to do something with it. So we started to preserve it and put it on shelves, which I don't think is a bad thing. But then that led us to then be able to cut corners, right? Like on the example of bread, all bread used to be fermented and took time for that yeast to do its job. And now we've been able to cut out that whole fermentation process and just mix a few ingredients together, and then boom, we call it bread. But it's certainly not that. So I think when it comes to what you're eating and where you're sourcing it from, take it back 100 years and think about, how was my family eating food and how can I emulate that? So the biggest proponent I would argue for is whole foods, whole perishable foods. Items like your meat, fruits, and vegetables, things that when you buy them, and if you don't consume them in a short while after, they're going to go bad. If you're able to have something sit on your countertop for weeks at a time and not let it go bad, that's generally probably not a good idea of something that you should consume on a regular basis. So I know that it's not easy for everyone to be able to eat that way, because we have been able to mass produce food, and it's the cheapest and most affordable food, and cost of living is hard across our nation. But if you're really serious about the longevity and quality of your life, then eating whole foods, perishable foods is the way to go. And as far as sourcing, you can get food online nowadays, shipped across the country from local farms if you don't have access to local farms. But I guarantee within 100 miles, you can find someone who is producing clean, ethical food that you can fuel your family with, if that's a high priority for you.
For sure. So some of that thought process was part of starting Colorado Craft Beef, was bringing people back to where their food comes from. Because we're on average, 3 to 4 generations removed from food production, of actually, either having your hands in the dirt or raising the animals from the time they're born until they become, your steak or your dinner for your family. So part of that thought process was like, hey, let's really bring people back into that fold of where food really comes from. And to your point, maybe a little better understanding of why it is different and why it takes, for most cases with what we're putting on the table with CCB, we're 24 months about on average from the time that animal is born to the time it becomes steak. And of course, we have all the process of being able to ship, etc. But a lot of really good things do truly take time. And I think that is lost in our society of instant gratification and right here, right now. So to your point of let's being mindful about what we're consuming, being mindful of where it comes from, how it got here. I would say I think your historical references are great because we talk about, wars and seeing famine, actually going through times of being hungry. And I'd say our generation, Derran, we really had not experienced that up until COVID. And food was not right now on the shelf. So that thought process definitely changed a lot of consumers' mindset about where their food comes from, and getting back to, hey, I want to know that I have high quality food. Doesn't just land on the grocery store shelves. Somebody's actually producing that somewhere. Somebody's hands were a part of that, and that's part of what you've been essential in helping to tell our story of how that food is produced. What happens on the ranch every day, which seems to be ever evolving each and every day. But being able to shed light on that to somebody who is really, not involved in that. Maybe you live in a high rise where, you just don't have the exposure to it. So those are some of the things that, we as a company, I feel like have been able to hone in on with help from your perspective, Derran.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, in our generation, there has been a shift of wanting to get back closer to our food sources because the opportunities that were available for generations before, as far as, their economic growth and thing is shifted in our generation. And there is the ability to, through technology, as we continue to advance, to where we are going to get more and more of our own time back. And so I think there is that shift of like, what are we going to do with that extra time? And I think a lot of people are trending to, man, I do want to learn how to make sourdough, and I do want to start a garden and start canning and preserving. And I think that does come on the heels of COVID, because to your point, the shelves were bare. And so I think a lot of people, it was a wake-up call to say, like, I don't know if something like this happens again, how am I going to be able to feed myself and my family? And so I think there was a big drive there for people to pursue these different means of being self-reliant and self-sufficient, which I think at the end of the day is just great. Whether or not you need to have you need to deploy those tools, just having them in your toolkit is very valuable.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the deeper that toolbox can be, no matter what it is, the more you feel capable and you feel empowered. And I would say that to listeners, to continue to go out and grow and be curious and learn about where your food comes from. Learn how to make your food. I recently delved into making soap. That was something that I never thought I would do, quite frankly, but it was actually kind of fun. When you see something come to life that you made with your own two hands, it's like that sense of gratification, like, hey, yeah, I can do this. This is pretty cool. And to another layer of that, try to continue to instill that in our children. Because when they realize they can do hard things, they continue to do hard things instead of, the path of least resistance of giving up and moving on. And, that just like that level of resiliency that comes along with being like, hey, that was hard, but I did it. And I know I can do it again.
Absolutely. And hardship's a part of life. It's inherent to our being. Because there's talk and argument a lot of times that if you were given everything that you needed, you would burn it down as fast as you could just to get back to suffering. And it's just a part of our growth cycle as humans that, we desire to be challenged. So seeking out those challenges, we should definitely pursue them.
Sure. So you mentioned from a nutritional perspective, shift back to that for a second, that, when you were working out a ton, and you were on, primarily vegetarian diet, how your body felt as far as energy, strength, some of those things. Could you dive into that and then kind of frame for us the thought process around fueling your body with protein, particularly, heavy lifting, a lot of physical activity.
Absolutely, yeah. So the vegetarian diet for me was more ethically based. Again, I wanted to know that if I was going to be consuming an animal, that it was well cared for, it was given a life. Um, I didn't even think at those times at how many creatures unfortunately lose their life for a vegetarian diet that then otherwise, will feed the soil and maybe some vultures or things, but otherwise is dying without a purpose. And so eating that vegetarian diet, it was ethically based, but in the gym and in strength, I noticed that I wasn't as capable as when I was eating more of a diverse diet. And so when I did have the opportunity to understand and afford where my beef was coming from, and I transitioned to that, like I said, it was almost like turning on a light switch. Like all of a sudden, all this energy, all this decognitive thinking just came flooding back. It was like putting fuel back into the factory. And it was a big wake up call for me to understand that, hey, this diet isn't a problem on a large scale. It's just not good for me. And I come to realize that eating a primarily meat-based diet benefits me the most because I don't have nearly as much gas ever. I don't have acne or skin issues from eating a primarily meat-based diet. My physique as far as like weight control, it stays steady when I don't have the ability to exercise at the frequency or intensity that I want. So it was very easy for me to see that eating this way of life was benefiting me more than eating a strictly vegetarian diet. And so I would just call back to whatever it is that you are implementing as a diet in your life, listen to your body and see how it affects you and implement it as such. And I started to, and I keep eating this way because I want to have longevity and quality of life. Because, people, when I was in the training, in the personal training realm, it was, oh, I don't have the time or I don't have the money. It's like, well, you're going to be spending that time and money one way or the other. You're either going to spend it up front by putting in the work and hedging your bets that you're going to keep that longevity and quality of life, or you're going to pay for it on the back end because you're in such bad health that then you're spending that time going to doctor's offices, you're spending that money on medications, and you're having that lower quality of life. So it's a balance beam of, do you want to put in the work now and have that quality and longevity of life, or do you want to skip that and then potentially have a rougher end of life experience?
Absolutely. And of course, everybody has their own frame of reference around these things, your own personal experience. And mine, I watched and continue to watch my dad, who's a 67-year-old rancher that has used his body his entire life. And I say used, I mean, he has used his body. He rode bulls professionally for, from the time he was like 15 till he was 30. So roughly 15 years. He beat his body up pretty good and still literally uses it every day. And he eats primarily meat because, beef. You don't say chicken around here, but yeah. So he eats beef every day, not quite 3 times a day, but pretty close. And he's in better shape than most 20-year-olds I know. I mean, it's incredible to see the differences, not only in lifestyle, but diet, and a lot of that coming into a thought process. That's something that I personally have become more in tune with, of how does that impact your mental health as well. And that's something that I think we don't pull into the entire equation, is not only our physical health, but our mental health. What's going on from, what you're fueling your body with, and how is it impacting you in your interaction with the world?
Exactly. And that was something, funny enough, I learned outside of schooling, because it was when you're in schooling, the health, it's all about physical health, right? There's no talk about the mental health side, but that side, if you're clinically insane, but you're 1% body fat, like, are you still healthy? I would argue no, right? Like, you need to have that, that mental health side. And so my approach to physical training and personal training was, the personal training was my platform. It was my ability to get in front with people and exercise with them, teach them to work out, give them the tools necessary to be successful on their own. But we spent a lot of our session time and conversation about mental health, because my pie chart of health was, you have your mental health, your physical health, and your spiritual health, whatever that may be. But we need to fulfill and make sure all three of those pies or slices are healthy, in order to achieve your optimum health. And diet certainly fills or plays a big role in mental health.
You brought up a great point that I'd love to dive into. Not only, from my perspective, because I'm a scientist by trade, and I have dealt with many different, science-minded people, whether it's been veterinarians or PhD cattle nutritionists, or, a lot of incredibly well-educated people. And the system that they were educated in, and this is not against the system, it's more of an interesting thought process that we talk so much about health, so animal health professionals, that's the big thing, is health. Yet when I ask them how many hours of nutrition training they had in school, and they look at me and with blank stares, they're like, really, we had none. We may have had one class. Yet we're so focused on health from the science perspective, yet we're not bringing the nutrition piece into it. I'm like, oh man, that's something that, with actually my background, I have a master's degree in cattle nutrition, where we're focused on the interface between health and nutrition, because we know how instrumental that is to overall health. I'd like to hear how that was approached in school from your perspective.
Yeah, so I have a 4-year degree. The first 2 years are just an extension of high school. Like, you're redoing high school stuff. The last 2 years is when I actually got into my degree and started taking coursework about what I wanted to study in. Of all those credit hours, I had one course, and it was on nutrition. And my professor wrote the book that we used, right? So, and what was taught in there was the, current food pyramid, which, after getting out of schooling and doing my own researching and questioning everything as you should, as anybody who's in a science field, it was astounding to find out that, lobbyists and things play a role in how stuff like that is created. Because if you think back to the 1930s through the 50s, right, doctors were prescribing cigarettes and saying, hey, smoke this brand, less cough, less burn. Why? Because the cigarette companies were approaching them, giving them money to say, hey, this is a healthy option for X, Y, and Z. And the same thing is happening in our food system, because why do they want you to eat a primarily grain-based diet? Because it's cheap to grow, it's cheap to produce food, and it's cheap to get it to you. They don't necessarily care about your overall health. They just want to continue making money off of you. And so we were taught that food pyramid in school. And again, it was another blanket approach to, hey, you should eat this much stuff and stay away from this, as opposed to understanding that we're all so diverse individuals that you have to really implement your own. And I'm a firm believer too, of, as far as what you're more optimized to break down and turn into nutrients for yourself, may come from your ancestry. If you are Grecian and you grew up and your ancestry bloodline comes from Greece, your microbiome was adapted through generations on that Mediterranean style diet. And then you move to America and you're putting all this weight on, and it's like, what's going on? It's like, well, your body hasn't had time to adapt to this new American style diet and what we put in our foods and things. So I think having a good understanding of where did my lineage come from and what food sources were generally available for them, and maybe starting there, shifting your diet to that and eating more of what your ancestry ate, can give you a good understanding of like, ooh, maybe this is the balanced diet that I personally need to start eating.
Yeah, that's really insightful to take all of those different facets into the equation. Something that just came to me, as the resident cow nerd at CCB, I correlate a lot of things back to cow science. And as you were talking through the different part of, human nutrition and that thought process, I was like, man, from a cow nutritionist perspective, basically it is categorized to different classes of animals. So younger animals have a different protein requirement versus energy requirement. And it changes as an animal ages because they have a biological endpoint that they naturally get to. And it changes if they're gestating or if they are lactating. Like the different protein energy requirements do change depending on the type of life, stage of life, and or, what you're asking for that animal to do. But it's not a eat this or eat that. It's a protein and energy ratio. Of course, your micronutrients, everything has to be in balance. But of course, we're not the same as cows, but we also are mammals. And a lot of the thought process still can be very similar, instead of saying eat this or do this and don't do that, versus how are we fueling your body from a protein level or energy level or, whatever that kind of macro nutrient may be, instead of saying this or that. And from a cow perspective, we have different lineages of cattle, and they naturally either have a higher propensity to fat or they have a higher propensity to red meat. That's kind of the two buckets that they land into. And that's where a lot of our, crossbreeding programs have come from, is to kind of balance that. So to your point with human nutrition, your ancestry can make a difference in what you need, what your body needs. So, well, Derran, I think we're pretty close to time. I'd love for you to kind of wrap up with some closing thoughts for our listeners.
Yeah, it's whatever journey you're on, whatever results you're looking to achieve, journal, write things down, track it, have an understanding of, if you get to a point where you're having, you're not feeling well, or you notice you're bloating, you need that written track record to be able to look back and call upon and pinpoint things, because our memories were over inundated with information and things coming all the time. And to think back like, oh, well, 2 days ago I had this, it's a hard thing to do. So if you're really serious about your weight, your diet, your energy, your exercise, all that, track it all down so you can pinpoint anything that may be causing something. And then if you're wanting to get healthier, just move your body. It doesn't have to be exercise in the way that we think of it, of going to the gym and being on the treadmill and lifting weights. Going out and gardening, going out and splitting wood, anything, that all counts and adds up. So the more movement that you can get throughout your day, the better off you're going to be in the long run. So just move your body and eat healthy and clean, and whatever that looks like for you. And if you want, try to support some local people. See if you can find farmers markets, see if you can find local butchers, and have a better understanding of where your food comes from.
Solid advice. Getting back to the basics and getting back to where your food comes from. So as we wrap up today's episode, let's leave you with some additional food for thought. In a world where every choice matters, let's approach consumption with mindful attention. Seek knowledge, engage in conversations, and shape your legacy with purpose. This is Kara Smith signing off Steak Bites Podcast. Till next time, savor every bite of existence and let your actions resonate with the wonder of the world.